Hi everyone. In our previous class we were talking about the presidency of Guatemala from 1944 way up to the 1950s, and in fact we ended up our discussion by talking about the presidency of Jacobo Arbenz and his vision to create an agricultural reform. In the agricultural reform that Arbenz planted or proposed, it was an idea whereby the government would expropriate land, meaning make a law that would enable the government to take away land from the rich people legally and give a compensation to those landowners. Now, as you would expect, this brought a lot of issues. And one of the major reasons for it is because the UFC, the United Food Company, which was an American agency, was involved in all of this process. So the United Food Company was about to lose millions of dollars, and of course they saw this governmental move as a threat to their business and as a threat to American business as well. So today we're going to be talking about the US intervention in Guatemala in the 1950s. Basically, we're going to be looking at how the actions of Jacobo Arbenz promulgated or created this scenario for American CIA-driven, Marine-driven, Guatemalan-driven as well, Guatemalan rebel-driven invasion of Guatemala and eventual ousting of Jacobo Arbenz. So the title for today's class is The U.S. Intervention in Guatemala in the 1950s. This occurred in 1954. We're going to be looking at two different things for today. We're going to, one, justify why large landholders and the UFC disliked the government of Jacobo Arbenz. I think we've discussed partially some aspects of this. And secondly, we're going to describe the USA's intervention in Guatemala in 1954. So as I was stating, all of the stakes were sort of aligning in this sense to see the United States intervene in Guatemala because they saw Jacobo Arbenz as a threat, because they saw a progressivist government, government that was looking for the interests of the poor, as a threat to their business interests as well. So as we had discussed in our previous class, Jacobo Arbenz created a land reform, and within this land reform, the big land, the large landholders would give up their lands, or they would forcibly be, the land would be forcibly removed. And of course, this placed Jacobo Arbenz as a target for the government of the United States, particularly because you have, for instance, the representatives from the United Food Company going directly to the President of the United States and asking the United States for some sort of support, particularly claiming that Jacobo Arbenz was using or had some sort of communist influence. The United Socialist Soviet Union or Republic was having some influence in the region. It is worth noting that all of this is happening in the context of the Cold War, where the United States is fighting against the USSR as it relates to capitalism and communism. So here you have the UFC going to the American government and telling the American government that an ally is about to be formed for the USSR in Guatemala. So this plays to an extent, or put alarms to a larger extent, we could say, because it was not only the removal of lands, but it was also the influence of the USSR in the Central American region. So at this point, you see that the United States acted not only to protect the interests of the USC, but also to protect the region from quote-unquote communism, which at this point was the biggest threat to them. So as we move along, eventually the UFC and the elite classes, particularly the right-wing people, the right-wing politicians, began to portray the government of Jacobo Arbenz as an arm of communism. And eventually, you see the United States launching a campaign whereby they began to discredit the government of Arbenz, and you see that almost all of the countries neighboring Guatemala were now turning against Guatemala. They did not want that sort of influence in their region. The United States began to use mass media. At this point, they were dropping newspapers and leaflets from airplanes onto villages, cities, and towns. So they began to drop off all sorts of propaganda to spread negative things about Jacobo Arbenz, inciting the people to stand up against the government that was giving some of them, the poor classes, land. So in addition to that, the United States came out of those borders, came out of Guatemala, and began to influence other Central American governments to support the ousting of Jacobo Arbenz. Mind you, Jacobo Arbenz was a democratically and constitutionally elected leader in Guatemala. However, even though the United States was rampant all throughout the region, stating that communism was in Guatemala, until today, there is still no evidence that Jacobo Arbenz was influenced by the Soviet Union or influenced by communist ideas. Although Jacobo Arbenz did state that he was a socialist. So eventually, the United States, to protect the interests of the UFC and also to protect the interests of an anti-communist ambition in the region, the United States decides to intervene. They eventually some exiles, some Guatemalan exiles in Honduras. They prepare them from one of their operations, and the whole operation of removing Jacobo Arbenz from government was called PB Success. However, at one particular point, when the CIA began to train some of these men, you had an operation called El Diablo taking place. So the United States was preparing for an all-out war. The United States took out some of the guns and ammunition that they had in Nicaragua. They were training some Guatemalans, and they were also giving some sort of support. Eventually, these same people that were trained in Honduras invaded Guatemala, and you have the United States helping them as well by bombarding doing small bombardings with planes that had no markings on it, just to not show that it was them. Eventually, the people that invaded reached way to Guatemala City, and at that point in 1954, the Guatemalan army stated to Arbenz that they no longer supported Arbenz, and at that point you see that Jacobo Arbenz is forced to resign, and once he resigns, the United States places a puppet president that basically undoes everything that Jacobo Arbenz had already done in Guatemala. So basically, Arbenz was trying to create a balance as it relates to land distribution, and the United States intervened and removed that balance once more and left the UFC with their portion of land and gave the elites once more their large portions of land. So for today, we have come to the end of this class, but there's a big issue that is happening. As you know, we have land issues in Belize as well. I am sure you guys are hearing the news, and you heard the news about Nigel Petillo being arrested and all of his activism. We're going to talk about that next class. The reason for that is because land distribution has been a major issue in the region because of the neoliberal policies that the countries have taken or used. So I want you to research about the land distribution imbalance in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and this as it relates to the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. I want you to research about these land distributions, particularly for you to understand how land was in the hands of a few in these countries, and yet the majority had barely nothing. And this is what basically began to fuel ideas of revolutions, which is the next topic that we're going to be talking about. So all of these revolutions eventually led to a refugee crisis, a migration crisis, which we're still seeing around in Central America and the United States. So it's a very important topic, so I ask you to please research about it. It's a very plain thing that I want you to do. In the comments section for the YouTube link, I want you to put land distribution for El Salvador, for example. In 1970 was, in 1980 was, in 19 sorry, this is supposed to be 60 and 70 and then 80. It was this, blah blah blah. And then you say for Guatemala it was this, for Honduras it was this. All I want you to do is to understand the land inequality that is there. Please comment that. It's going to be a bonus points for that. So take advantage of it.